The water in the trough was the color of old pewter and smelled of iron and late summer rot. Elias Cord stood ankle-deep in the mud beside it, a rusted hand pump in his grip, working the lever with the mechanical patience of a man who had long since made peace with difficult things. The sun was doing what the July sun in the Utah Territory always did, trying to kill everything it touched. It pressed down on the back of his neck like a branding iron held an inch short of the skin. Hot enough to warn. Hot enough to remind you of its power without finishing the job. He heard the wagon before he saw it. The creak and complaint of dry axles, the hollow percussion of hooves on sun-baked road, the soft jangling of a harness going loose at one shoulder. He did not look up immediately. A man who spent 20 years in land like this learned that sounds did not always require attention. Sometimes a thing coming toward you just needed to pass. But this one slowed. Then stopped. Elias straightened, wiped his hands down the front of his canvas trousers and turned toward the road that cut along the south edge of his property. The wagon was a Studebaker farm model, battered until its original paint was nothing but memory and rust suggestion. 2 mules stood in the traces, their heads low, their ribs visible enough to count from 20 yards. On the wagon's bench sat a man holding the reins loosely, like someone holding on to something he was no longer certain was worth holding. Beside him, so close their shoulders touched, sat a girl of perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Her hair was braided but half unraveled, and her eyes, large and serious and the deep amber of creek water over flat stone, were fixed on Elias with an unnerving, measuring calm. The man was lean in the way of someone who had once been strongly built and had been reduced by something. Not age alone. Something that took more than time. His jaw was set, his eyes cautious, and there was a bruise, old and yellowed, along the left side of his neck that Elias pretended not to see. "You Cord?" the man asked. His voice was low and careful. "I am. I'm Harlan Voss. This is my daughter, May." He paused. "We answered your notice. The one in the Millhaven Courier. Looking for a hired hand." Elias looked at them both. He looked at the mules, the wagon's poor state, the single trunk battered into the wagon bed, and the way the girl leaned slightly in front of her father. As if she were already trying to be a shield for something fragile behind her. "Your daughter is beautiful," Elias said quietly. It was not flattery. It was the plain acknowledgement of a man who meant what he said. Harlan Voss looked at him then, really looked, and something shifted behind his eyes. The caution didn't leave, but something else entered alongside it. Warmth, maybe. Or hope, which in worn men often looked the same. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. "I was hoping," Harlan said, his voice dropping half a register, "you'd notice me too. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The property Elias Cord had worked for 11 years was not a beautiful place by any conventional measure. It sat on 40 acres of high desert grassland at the base of a sandstone shelf that turned the color of dried blood at dusk. There was a main house, 2 rooms and a loft, built of cartonwood logs that had long since gone grey and tight-grained against the weather. There was a barn that needed new siding on the north face. A root cellar with a door that dragged. A smokehouse that hadn't been used properly in 3 years, since before Elias's wife, Clara, had passed from a fever that the doctor in Millhaven had not been able to name let alone stop. The yard between these structures was swept dirt and stubbornness. Elias swept it himself every morning because Clara had, and he saw no reason to abandon the habit just because the person who'd started it was gone. When Harlan climbed down from the wagon, Elias noticed the movement was slow and deliberate in a way that concealed pain. He was favoring his right side. He helped May down without being asked, his hand sure and gentle on her, and she landed on her feet and immediately turned to assess the property with those amber eyes that miss nothing. "Small," she said. "Not unkind. Just accurate." "May," Harlan said softly. No, she's right, Elias said. It is small. But it's kept. He looked at Harlan. Barn is clean. The loft has a cot and a window on the west side. Get a breeze in the evening. I figured you'd want the girl close, so the house has a room off the kitchen. Wasn't much, but I cleared it last week. Harlan studied him. You cleared it last week? When I received your letter. Something passed between them, not yet enough to name, but real enough to feel. Harlan gave a single nod that carried more weight than most speeches. They unloaded in the fading afternoon heat. May carried things without being told. Small things, a canvas sack of dried beans. A wrap bundle that clinked softly, probably the last of their kitchen goods, a rag doll she held not with a child's careless love but with the deliberate care of someone protecting the last good thing. Elias watched her out of the corner of his eye and said nothing. The house, when they stepped inside, was what it was, the dwelling of a man who had been alone long enough to stop pretending it mattered. The floor was swept but unadorned. The table was solid pine, scarred by years, set with a single mismatched chair and a bench. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner of the kitchen, and above it, on rough-hewn shelves, sat the sparse inventory of a solitary life. Salt. Dried corn. A tin of lard. A half-empty jar of sorghum. 3 potatoes that needed to be used within the week. May stood in the doorway of the small side room. She turned back to look at her father, who stood looking at Elias. It'll do, Harlan said. There's more in the root cellar, Elias said. Onions. Dried venison. Some hard cheese wrapped in cloth. We can eat tonight if you're willing. I can cook, May said from the doorway. Elias turned to look at her. How old are you? 9.5. She said the half with grave importance. Can you make biscuits? She crossed her arms. I can make biscuits that'll make you sorry you ever ate any other biscuits. Harlan covered his mouth briefly with one hand. His eyes, above the hand, were wet. Then I suppose, Elias said. We'd better get started. What followed was the kind of hour that only happens in kitchens, the particular alchemy of people who do not yet know each other finding their positions around a shared task. Elias brought up the venison from the root cellar, dark and dry and smelling of wood smoke and preserved thyme. He sliced it thin with a bone-handled knife that had belonged to his father and set it in the cast-iron pan with a spoonful of lard. May dragged a chair to the counter without asking permission, climbed on it, and began working flour and water and a pinch of salt from the tin together in a crockery bowl with a confidence that stopped all conversation. Harlan moved quietly. He found the onions and began peeling them at the table, working with his left hand more than his right. When Elias glanced at him, Harlan simply said, "Right hand goes slow some days," and left it at that. Elias nodded and did not look again. The stove heated the kitchen until the smell of venison fat and browning onion filled the room like a physical thing. Outside, the sun finally conceded and dropped behind the sandstone shelf, and the light through the single kitchen window went from brass to copper to a deep, bruised violet. May's biscuits went into the Dutch oven with an authority that commanded respect. She set it on the stove top and crossed her arms again and watched it like a sentry. They ate at the scarred table. 3 plates, Elias had to find a third one in the back of the shelf, wipe the dust from it with his shirt tail. The biscuits were, as threatened, extraordinary. Flaky and dense at the center, pulling apart in soft layers with the steam rising off them in the cooling kitchen air. Nobody spoke much at first. The sounds were spoons against pottery, the faint percussion of Harlan's boot against the table leg without rhythm or purpose, just movement. The way exhausted bodies keep moving even when the mind wants stillness. May ate with her eyes moving around the room, cataloguing, measuring. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." "Since when?" "May," Harlan said. 3 years, Elias answered. "My wife passed." "Clara." He stopped. Rebuilt the sentence. She would have liked seeing a child at this table. May considered this with the solemn fairness of a judge. What was her favorite thing to cook? Elias looked at the girl. Something loosened behind his sternum. Apple butter, he said. She made it every fall. The whole house smelled like cinnamon for a week. We had apple trees, May said. At our old house. She did not elaborate. Neither did anyone push her to. After supper, Harlan washed the dishes without being asked. Elias dried them and set them back on the shelf. They worked side by side at the wash basin with a quietness between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who had both, separately, learned the particular discipline of getting through a day. When May had been put to bed in the side room, Harlan sitting on the edge of the narrow cot, speaking low and private until her breathing evened, he came back to the main room. Elias was sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. Harlan sat on the bench. He leaned his forearms on his knees. He did not look at Elias. He looked at the floor. I want to be honest with you, he said. I expect that would be best. I'm not running from the law. I didn't ask. No. Harlan exhaled. You didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I'm running from something that used to call itself family. Elias drank his coffee. Outside, the first cricket of evening started up, and then another, and then the whole dark yard was full of them. A man does what he has to for his children, he finally said. Harlan looked at him then. A long, assessing look. Yes, he said. He does. The first week settled in with the rhythm of hard work, which was the only rhythm Elias trusted. He put Harlan on the north barn siding first, new planks to be cut, fitted, and nailed against the coming autumn wind. Harlan worked without complaint, though the first morning Elias noticed him resting the right hand more than using it. By the third day, without discussion, they had adapted to a wordless system. Elias held the boards, Harlan drove the nails left-handed, and the work went on. May attached herself to the property as though she had always belonged to it. She swept the porch each morning before Elias had finished his first coffee. She weeded the kitchen garden with a focused fury, pulling ragweed from between the bin rows with personal grievance. She found 3 hens Elias had let go half-feral along the back fence and, over 4 patient days, coaxed them back into the coop with a trail of corn and an unshakable will. You've got away with difficult creatures, Elias told her on the 4th evening, watching her latch the coop door. She looked up. Papa says the same about me with him. She said it matter-of-factly and walked back toward the house. And Elias stood in the yard for a moment looking after her with something complicated moving through his chest. He taught her where the good fishing holes were in the creek that ran along the eastern property line. She was a quick learner, sitting beside him on a flat limestone shelf, her bare feet hanging over the edge above the current, her line in the water with a patience unusual in children her age. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat with the creek moving below them and the cottonwood leaves flickering silver in the afternoon light, and this, Elias thought, was its own kind of conversation. With Harlan, the thawing came differently. Men who have been hurt protect themselves differently than children do. Children go quiet or go wild. Men go careful. They watch their words and their movements and they perform self-sufficiency as a kind of armor. Elias recognized it because he had worn the same armor himself for 3 years. The thawing came in small ruptures. The evening Harlan, passing through the kitchen, paused behind Elias at the stove to look over his shoulder at what he was cooking, corn mash and side pork, and said, very quietly, "Smells like something worth sitting down for." The afternoon Elias came back from checking the east fence line to find Harlan had repaired the root cellar door without being asked. Rehung it on proper iron hinges he'd found in the barn, so that it no longer dragged and scraped but swung clean. Small things. Unmistakable things. One evening, 9 days after their arrival, Elias set a small paper sack on the table before supper. Harlan looked at it without touching it. "What's this?" "Lemon drops," Elias said, going back to the stove. "May's been fighting a sore throat. They help." Harlan stood at the table looking at the sack of yellow sweets for a long moment. Then he picked it up, held it, and set it back down carefully. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know it," Elias said. 40 miles south and 3 days' ride, in the brittle flatland town of Canaan Fork, a man sat at the rear table of a saloon that smelled of spilled tobacco and unwashed ambition. His name was Devereaux Voss, Harlan's brother by blood and nothing else. He was broad through the shoulders, with a face the hard sun and harder drinking had turned to red leather, and he had a patience for cruelty that men who knew him found unsettling. He had come to Canaan Fork following a rumor, the way a predator follows a scent, not hurrying, not alarmed. Just moving with the certainty of something that knows its prey does not have enough of a head start. The man across the table from him was a tracker who went by the single name Creel. He was eating beans from a tin with a folding knife and seemed unbothered by the weight of Devereaux's gaze. "Millhaven," Creel said without looking up. "Small outfit up off the North Road. Man named Cord owns it. 40 acres. Cartonwood house." Devereaux turned his glass in a slow circle on the table. "My brother. The girl. Both of them." Creel ate another bite. "Settled in, by the sounds of it." "He ran off with what wasn't his to take," Devereaux said. His voice was even, almost mild, in the way of men who do not need to perform their anger. "The girl is my brother's blood, which makes her Voss blood. And my brother owes a debt." "That right?" Creel did not ask it as a question. "You find me that property," Devereaux said. "And you find me a man who knows how a door opens quietly in the night." Creel folded his knife and looked up for the first time. "That kind of work costs more than tracking work." Devereaux reached into his coat and set a folded quantity of bills on the table between the bin tin and the whiskey glass. Creel looked at it. Then he picked it up and slipped it inside his vest without counting it, because men like Creel knew better than to count money in front of men like Devereaux Voss. Millhaven, Utah Territory, was the kind of town that sustained itself on two things, the cattle trade and other people's business. It had a mercantile, a church, a livery, a physician's office, a sheriff's office whose occupant was a decent man named Aldersfitch, and a saloon called the Painted Axle where the town's real governance took place after sundown. It had approximately 400 people, at least half of whom appeared to have nothing more pressing to do than observe the lives of the other half and deliver their findings to interested parties. Elias drove the wagon into town on the 17th day after Harlan and May's arrival. He needed flour, lamp oil, and baling wire. Harlan sat beside him on the bench. May sat in the wagon bed behind them, her feet dangling over the back gate, watching the road unspool behind the wheels. She had insisted on wearing her better dress, faded blue calico. Pressed with a flat iron she'd heated on the stove that morning without asking, and had rebraided her own hair with a precision that suggested she was making a point to someone not yet present. They were noticed before the wagon had fully stopped in front of the mercantile. This was inevitable. Millhaven had not missed the notice Elias had placed in the courier, and it had certainly not missed the smoke from the Cartonwood house coming from more than one direction, morning and evening. In the week since, people had seen what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was something to discuss over supper. The mercantile was run by a man named Foster Cale, who was 53 years old, wide through the middle, narrow through the eyes, and deeply invested in the moral ledger of the county. He was behind the counter when Elias came through the door, and he watched Harlan follow him in with the particular stillness of a man assembling an opinion. "Cord," he said. Nodded. Then, to Harlan, "Don't believe we've met." "Harlan Voss," Harlan said. He did not extend his hand, which Cale noticed. "Hired man," Cale said. He directed it at Elias, but his eye stayed on Harlan. "That's right," Elias said. He set his list on the counter. "Flour, lamp oil, baling wire. Whatever you have on dried apples." Cale looked at the list, then looked up. "You know there's talk," he said. His voice had taken on the particular texture of a man delivering news he claims to regret but does not. "Talk is cheap," Elias said. How much for the flour? Living arrangement like yours, Cale continued, ignoring the question. A man alone, a man with a child, a daughter, May, Elias said. What? Her name is May. Not a daughter. His voice was even. Flour. Oil. Wire. Cale's jaw tightened. He began pulling items. But his mouth, clearly, was not finished. I'm only saying what others are saying. Reverend Hartup has remarked on it. Mrs. Fitch as well. A single man, a widower, Elias said. And a man with a child, living under the same roof. People wonder about he paused, selecting the word. Propriety of it. Harlan, who had been standing at the far end of the counter examining a display of harness hardware with an expression that showed nothing, now turned. He crossed the floor slowly and stood beside Elias at the counter. He was not large in the imposing sense. But he had the stillness of something that had survived enough that it was no longer afraid of a man with opinions. He looked at Cale without heat. Mr. Cale, he said, I have a 9-year-old girl who has not had a roof over her head that didn't leak in 8 months. I have a man who gave her a room and put food on the table the first night and hasn't asked for a thing in return except the work my hands can do. You want to tell me what part of that requires the reverend scrutiny? Cale looked at him, then at Elias, then back at the list. He began totaling without further commentary. Outside, the more damaging conversation was already underway. The woman who had been waiting at the far side of the mercantile porch, a Mrs. Drusilla Marsh, who held the honorary position of town memory, which meant she remembered everything that could be used to disadvantage anyone, had observed Elias and Harlan entering together and had taken herself immediately across the street to the post office, where 3 other women were collecting their mail, and had delivered her observations with the solemnity of a biblical recitation. May, sitting on the wagon bench where Elias had told her to wait, heard every word across the quiet of the midday street. She heard the arrangements and unsuitable and what that child is being exposed to and no woman in the house to set things right. She sat very still. Her jaw was set in a way that was her father's jaw exactly. She did not cry. She stared at the group of women with those creekwater amber eyes until Mrs. Marsh, feeling the weight of it, looked over and found herself pinned by a 9-year-old girl's stare and had the grace, at least, to lower her voice. When Elias came out of the mercantile with Harlan behind him carrying half the load, he took one look at May's face and understood exactly what had happened. He loaded the goods without haste. Then he walked across the street to the post office. The women watched him come. Ladies, he said. His voice was flat and courteous and left no room. I'm aware of the conversation. I want to be clear about something. Harlan Voss is a man of good character who works my land and keeps my property better than I've kept it myself. His daughter is a child who deserves the same respect you would give any child in this town. If you have concerns about the arrangements on my property, you are welcome to come out and see them for yourselves. My door will be open. But I will not stand for the other kind of talk. Not about the man. And not about the girl. He let the quiet hold for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. Good afternoon. He walked back to the wagon. He climbed up. Harlan was already in his seat. May was sitting very straight between them now, pressed against her father's side. Elias slapped the reins and the mules moved. They were a quarter-mile out of town before anyone spoke. You didn't have to do that, Harlan said. You said that before, Elias said. About the lemon drops. I meant it both times. So did I. May, between them, reached out very quietly and put her small hand over Elias's hand on the reins. She did not look at him. She looked straight ahead at the road. He felt the warmth of it move all the way up his arm. He did not look at her either. He looked at the road. But his hand turned slightly, just slightly, so that his palm was up and her hand was held. Creel arrived at the property 3 weeks after Devereux Voss had paid him in the Canaan Fork saloon. He arrived the way people with intentions like his always arrived, at 3 in the morning, when the land was at its quietest and the darkness was absolute and full of its own sound. He came on foot, having left his horse at a draw a half-mile south, and he moved along the fence line with a professional patience, cataloguing the outbuildings, noting the position of lights and windows. What he did not know, what a man with his particular education could not account for, was that Elias Cord had not slept well since the evening 3 days prior when a stranger in Millhaven had asked Foster Cale at the Mercantile whether he knew of a man named Voss who might have recently settled in the county. Cale, being Cale, had mentioned it to 3 people. One of those 3 people had mentioned it to Aldous Fitch at the sheriff's office. Fitch had ridden out to the Cord property that same afternoon and told Elias plainly and without embellishment what had been asked and by whom. The name Voss, offered to Harlan, had produced a silence dense enough to press a hand against. "That would be my brother," Harlan had finally said. "Tell me," Elias had said. Harlan had told him. A property dispute, land in Harlan's name that Devereux believed ought to be shared, which in Devereux's language meant owned entirely by Devereux. A marriage that Devereux had engineered by debt and then watched fall apart. A mother who had left before May was old enough to remember leaving. Devereux's belief, persistent and tyrannical, that May was leverage to be used in whatever game he was currently playing, and his fury at Harlan for removing her from the board. The yellowed bruise along Harlan's neck had not needed further explanation after that. So Elias had not slept well. And on this particular night, he had not slept at all. He was sitting in the chair by the front window, which looked out over the yard and the road and the darkness, when he heard the dog, Old Preacher, a blue heeler who slept on the porch, give a single low sound that was not quite a bark but was not nothing. Elias was already out of the chair and had the rifle from above the door before the sound had fully ended. He did not light a lamp. He stood in the open door and let his eyes work in the darkness, which after a minute gave back more than people expected. The yard was silver-grey in starlight. The barn was a solid dark shape. The fence line along the south there. A movement at the edge of the root cellar, where the shadow of the overhang made a pool of black deeper than the surrounding dark. Someone, crouching, trying the latch of the root cellar door. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked across the yard at a measured pace, making no attempt to be silent. If a man crouching at your root cellar at 3 in the morning didn't hear you coming, that was his problem. The rifle was at his shoulder before he reached the edge of the overhang's shadow. "Stand up," he said quietly. He did not shout. In the nighttime quiet, a normal voice carried the distance needed. The shape stood. It resolved itself into the lean silhouette of a man in a canvas duster, hat down, face obscured. Creel. Though Elias did not know his name yet. "I'm not looking for trouble," Creel said. His voice was professionally calm, which told Elias immediately what kind of man this was. "You're on my property at 3 in the morning with your hands on my door," Elias said. "You're going to have to explain to me how that isn't trouble. I'm looking for someone. This is a working ranch. Nobody is hiding here." "A man named Voss," Creel said. "And a child." The word child, in this man's mouth, in the dark, at this hour, produced in Elias a cold clarity that moved through him like creek water in spring. He did not move the rifle. He did not raise his voice. He said, with a precision that was more frightening than volume, "I'm going to say this once. Whatever business sent you to my property, it ends here. If you come back, in the day, in the night, in any configuration, I will not ask you to stand up. I will not speak first. I will be telling nothing except the sheriff the following morning what I found and where I found it. Are we understood?" Creel looked at him. He was a man who assessed risk for a living. He assessed it now. The rifle. The stillness of the man holding it. The absence of anything that looked like uncertainty. "I'm just the messenger," Creel said. "Then deliver this one," Elias said. "Go back to whoever paid you and tell him that Harlan Voss is employed on legitimate property under a legitimate arrangement. And that any approach, legal or otherwise, will be answered by every legal instrument this territory provides. And tell him something else from me personally. He paused. The girl has someone who will stand between her and whatever that man thinks is owed. As long as I can stand, she does. Creel stood in the dark for a moment. Then he walked. He walked south, along the fence line, without looking back, and the darkness swallowed him entirely within a dozen yards. Elias stood in the yard for a long time after. He lowered the rifle. Old Preacher padded over and sat beside his left boot. The stars above the sandstone shelf were brilliant and indifferent. The cricket sound had stopped during the confrontation and now began again, carefully, one by one. He heard the door behind him. Soft footsteps. Harlan's footsteps, he knew them from 3 weeks of shared mornings. Harlan came and stood beside him. He looked at the empty fence line and the darkness beyond it. He had the look of a man who had heard enough from inside the house to understand what had just happened. He stood very still. "That was my brother's doing," he said. "I know it. He won't stop at a messenger. I know that too." Harlan stood with his arms at his sides. The damaged right hand hung slightly open, the way hands do when the man attached to them has nothing left to grip. "I shouldn't have brought this here," he said. "I shouldn't have brought it to your door." Elias turned and looked at him. In the starlight, Harlan's face was all plains and shadow, and his expression was the expression of a man preparing to lose something he had just barely begun to allow himself to want. "Stop that," Elias said. Harlan looked at him. "You came here because you answered a notice. You came here because your daughter needed a roof. You came here and you worked my land and fixed my root cellar door and you put food on a table that had only one chair." Elias's voice was low and unhurried and had the quality of bedrock, the kind of thing that doesn't move. "Whatever your brother thinks he's not owed anything that's on this property. That includes you. That includes May." Harlan said nothing for a moment. "Then, you can't promise that." "I can promise I'll die trying," Elias said. "Which is the only kind of promise that means anything." The quiet held between them. Then Harlan exhaled slowly, and the breath of it came out carrying something that had been compressed inside him for months, maybe years. He nodded once. His hand, the right one, lifted slightly and then rested on Elias's forearm for just a moment, the briefest, most deliberate contact. Not a handshake. Something quieter and more lasting than that. They went inside. The house was dark. From the side room, May's small, even breathing moved through the cracked door like a tide. Both men sat at the table for a while longer, not speaking, drinking cold coffee, listening to the night settle back to its ordinary sounds. It was Aldous Fitch who suggested the deed arrangement, which Elias should have thought of himself but had not because he was not, at heart, a legal strategist. He was a man who fixed things with his hands and his presence, and it had not occurred to him that in this territory, the most powerful tool available was a piece of paper filed in the right office. Fitch came out to the property 4 days after the night visit, which Elias had reported to him in full the following morning. Creel, it turned out, was known to Fitch by a different name but the same description, and Fitch had sent a wire to Canaan Fork immediately. The reply had confirmed Devereaux Voss's presence there and had included, on Fitch's request, a summary of the man's legal history, which was not short. Fitch sat at the kitchen table, the same scarred pine table that had hosted that first meal, and laid out what he knew with the methodical honesty of a sheriff who took his office seriously. Devereaux Voss had 2 outstanding judgments against him in Cedar County. He had, 3 years prior, attempted to claim his brother's registered land through a fraudulent deed filing that had been overturned by a circuit judge. He had been warned on 2 separate occasions by law enforcement in 2 separate territories for harassment of family members. What he wants, Fitch said, is the girl. Not out of love. Out of leverage. He believes if he has legal guardianship of the child, he can compel Harlan to sign over property in Cedar County that's still in Harlan's name. Harlan sat across the table. His expression was a careful thing, controlled but not closed. May was outside. They had waited until she was outside. What stops him from filing a guardianship claim? Harlan asked. The fact that you are alive and present and the legal father, Fitch said. But a man like Devros Voss will find a way to complicate that. See claim abandonment, claim and fit conditions. He'll point to the living arrangement here as evidence. A single man, a transient hired hand, that's the language they'd use. Elias said. Courts are not always reasonable places, Fitch said without apology. He looked between them. Which is why I'm going to suggest something that may sound abrupt. He folded his hands on the table. Elias. Your property is deeded in your name. If Harlan Voss is formally listed as a co-owner, even a partial holder, the legal picture changes entirely. A property-owning father in an established residence is a very different legal subject than a transient hired hand. Any guardianship claim Devros files gets substantially harder to sustain. Silence. Elias looked at Harlan. Harlan was looking at the table. I can't ask you to do that, Harlan said. You're not asking, Elias said. Fitch is suggesting. I'm deciding. Harlan looked up. It's your land. It was Clara's land. Clara believed in giving people a foothold, Elias said. She used to say the only point of having solid ground was to share it with someone who needed it. He paused. There's another way to do this that's cleaner legally, though I'll not pretend it's simple. He stopped. The thing he was about to say required an interior adjustment before it could be spoken aloud. He made that adjustment quietly, without drama. If you were willing, he said, a formal arrangement, a marriage, if it suited, would be the most legally unambiguous resolution available. It makes this house one household under the law. It makes May's residence here unassailable. It closes every door Devros Voss might try to open. He held Harlan's eyes steadily. I'm not asking for what I can't offer. I'm offering what the law would recognize. Everything else would be, as you chose it to be. Harlan was very still. He had gone the way of men who have been surprised by something they had been quietly hoping for, a stillness that is not absence but presence concentrated. He looked at Elias for a long time. Then he looked at his own hands on the table, the good left, the damaged right. You are a remarkable man, Harlan said. Very quietly. I'm a practical one, Elias said. No. Harlan shook his head slightly. That's not all you are. Fitch, to his credit, found the ceiling very interesting for several seconds and was quiet. The deed amendment was filed the following week. Both names on the property. Fitch witnessed it personally. The additional arrangement, filed quietly and without announcement, was witnessed by Fitch and the circuit clerk and nobody else. May was told in the kitchen, simply and directly, by both of them together, on a Thursday evening after supper while biscuit crumbs were still on the table. She looked at them for a long time with those amber eyes that miss nothing. Then she said, "So you're staying?" This directed at Elias. "Officially?" "We're all staying," Harlan said. May looked at Elias again. "Then I have a condition," she said. Elias looked at her carefully. "Go ahead." "Apple trees," she said. "I want apple trees in the fall so the house smells like cinnamon." The silence that followed was the kind that fills up from inside. Elias reached out and put his broad, weathered hand on top of May's small one on the table, the same gesture she had given him on the wagon bench coming home from town. "I'll order them from the nursery in Salt Lake," he said. 6 trees. "You choose the variety." She nodded, satisfied, and began clearing the supper dishes with the authority of someone who has made a fair negotiation and expects it to be honored. Devros Voss received the copy of the amended deed by post. He received, alongside it, a letter from Sheriff Aldous Fitch of Mill Haven that outlined, plainly and without emotional investment, the full legal position. The property was registered to 2 legal owners, one of whom was May Voss's father and lawful guardian, residing at a permanent address in an established household in Mill Haven County. Any guardianship filing would be contested, any trespass charge would be filed, and the outstanding judgments from Cedar County had been forwarded to the Millhaven Circuit Judge for review. The letter suggested, without insisting, that Devereux Voss might find his energies more productively directed elsewhere. Creel had already taken his money and moved along. Men like Creel knew when a situation had turned from an earnable problem into an expensive one. The town itself turned more slowly, as towns do. Mrs. Drusilla Marsh was not converted, exactly, but she was quieted, first by the deed filing, which she heard about from Foster Cale within hours, and second by a visit from May, who came into the mercantile with her father and Elias one Saturday morning and very deliberately purchased 2 penny candies, paid for them with her own coin, thanked Mr. Cale in a voice that rang like a small bell, and then turned and smiled at Mrs. Marsh with a guileless, enormous smile that left the woman with nothing useful to do with her opinion. Reverend Hartup came out to the property in September, ostensibly to discuss the harvest social. He stayed for supper. He ate 2 biscuits and part of a third and left with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man revising a position he had formed without adequate information. He never, to anyone's recollection, spoke critically of the Cord household again. The barn's north siding was finished by the end of August, tight against the oncoming autumn. Harlan's right hand, rested and worked carefully back to strength over the summer, had recovered enough to drive nails from both sides, and he did so with a satisfaction that was visible. Elias watched him from the yard and felt something he had not expected to feel again, not romance exactly, not yet fully, but the specific warmth of watching someone you care about find themselves competent and free. There were evenings after supper when they sat on the porch, all 3 of them, while the sandstone shelf went through its evening show of color, red to copper to violet. And the cricket started up, and May catalogued the stars with a focus that suggested she was memorizing them for future use. Elias and Harlan sat in the 2 chairs Elias had finally moved outside. They did not always speak, but the quiet between them now was different from the quiet of the early days. It had warmth in it. It had the quality of something shared rather than something merely endured. One evening, May pointed at a star low on the horizon and declared it the brightest one visible and therefore hers by right of discovery. Harlan said that wasn't how astronomy worked. She said she didn't care about astronomy, she cared about that star. Elias said it looked like a lemon drop. May said that was exactly what it looked like, and she seemed deeply satisfied by this, and leaned back against her father's knee and looked up at her star with the proprietorial peace of someone who has, after a long and uncertain journey, arrived exactly where they meant to be. There is a particular kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive in a single moment of revelation or a grand gesture that everyone can point to afterward and say, there, that was the turning point. It arrives the way spring arrives in high desert country, gradually, and then all at once, and sometimes you don't notice it until the first apple blossom appears on a tree you planted in faith, not certainty. 6 trees went into the ground that October, along the east fence line where the morning light would hit them first. May chose the variety from the nursery catalogue, Jonagold, for reasons she did not explain and was not asked to. She dug the holes herself, mostly, and she set the saplings in with the solemn care of a person who understands that some things require more patience than a single season. The house, that winter, smelled of cinnamon at Christmas, not from apples, which would take their time, but from a jar of cinnamon Elias brought home from the mercantile in December, wrapped in paper, tied with kitchen twine. He set it on the table without comment. Harlan found it in the evening and looked at it for a long moment before he looked at Elias, and what passed between them in that look required no translation. A broken place, given time and tending, does not merely recover. It grows differently, denser at the fracture point, more resistant than it was before the breaking. This is true of bones. It is true of wood. It is true, if you give them the chance, of the people who live inside the structures they build against the wind. The land endures. The patient endure alongside it. And on some evenings, when the shelf goes violet and the first stars appear and a child's voice names one of them hers by right of desire, the enduring begins to feel, almost without your permission, like something that deserves to be called joy.